There comes a moment in life when truth begins to speak louder than deception, when the consequences of actions start echoing through the corridors of time. Many people misunderstand karma thinking it is revenge, when in reality it is alignment, the natural order correcting what has been distorted. When dealing with a narcissistic individual, this principle becomes even more evident. You may find yourself wrongly accused, blamed, or even targeted as their life begins to unravel. But understand this clearly, their downfall is not your doing. It is the result of seeds they planted long before you arrived. Today we will explore the deeper reality behind this phenomenon, not emotionally, but intellectually and spiritually, so you can walk in clarity, not confusion. Karma is often misunderstood because people interpret it through emotion rather than principle. Many assume it is some kind of revenge system, as if life itself is reacting emotionally to what people do. But that is not how it works. Karma is not personal. It does not wake up one day and decide to punish someone. It is a law, consistent, neutral, and exact. Just like gravity does not choose who falls, consequences do not choose who they affect. They simply respond to what has been set in motion. Every action carries within it a built-in outcome. Not because someone is watching and judging, but because actions themselves are seeds. And seeds do not argue with the soil, they grow according to their nature. If someone plants deception, they may enjoy temporary advantage, but what grows from that seed cannot produce peace or stability. It may produce control for a season, but it will also carry confusion, distrust, and eventual collapse. That is not punishment, that is alignment. The result matches the nature of the input. This is where many people become confused when dealing with narcissistic behavior. When a narcissist begins to experience negative outcomes, broken relationships, loss of trust, emotional instability, they often interpret this as something being done to them. And because they avoid accountability, they search for someone to blame. If you were part of their life, especially if you challenged their behavior or stepped away from their control, you may become the focus of that blame. But their experience is not a reaction to you, it is a reaction to their own patterns. You must understand that consequences are cumulative. They are not always immediate. Just because someone appears to thrive while behaving destructively does not mean the law is not working. It means the process is unfolding. There is often a delay between action and outcome, and that delay can create the illusion that there are no consequences at all. But time does not cancel consequences, it reveals them. What is hidden in the beginning becomes visible in the end. When people build their lives on manipulation, they are constantly creating instability beneath the surface. They may maintain control by distorting truth, shifting narratives, and influencing perception, but they cannot control the internal structure of reality. Eventually, contradictions begin to appear. Relationships weaken, trust erodes, opportunities diminish. And when these results start to surface, it feels sudden to them, even though it has been developing all along. The danger for you is becoming emotionally entangled in their interpretation of events. If you begin to believe that their suffering is your responsibility, you will carry a weight that does not belong to you. You will start questioning your actions, doubting your decisions, and possibly re-entering situations that are harmful to your well-being. But clarity comes when you understand the nature of consequences. You did not create the seed, so you cannot be responsible for the harvest. This understanding also requires maturity. It is easy to look at someone's downfall and feel justified or even satisfied, but that is not the purpose of awareness. The purpose is clarity, not superiority. When you recognize that life operates through principles, you stop taking things personally. You begin to see patterns instead of isolated events. You understand that what people experience is connected to what they have consistently chosen, not what someone else has done to them. At the same time, this principle applies to you as well. Just as negative actions produce instability, positive alignment produces strength. When your actions are rooted in honesty, accountability, and growth, the outcomes may not always be immediate, but they are building something solid. Peace, clarity, and resilience are also results. They are the harvest of intentional living. So when a narcissist claims that you are the cause of their problems, you must return to this principle. Consequences are not assigned by opinion, they are produced by action. Their narrative may be loud, emotional, and persistent, but it does not override the law. You do not need to defend yourself against something that is not truly yours. Your responsibility is not to manage their perception, but to remain aligned with truth. Once you understand this, you gain freedom. You stop reacting to accusations that are rooted in avoidance. You stop trying to fix what is not within your control. And most importantly, you stop carrying guilt for outcomes that were never yours to begin with. That is the power of understanding karma, not as punishment, but as a system that ensures everything eventually becomes what it truly is. There is a critical weakness in the mindset of a narcissistic individual, and it is this: they cannot tolerate the weight of accountability. Responsibility requires humility, and humility requires self-awareness. But a narcissist has constructed an identity that must appear flawless, superior, and in control at all times. To admit fault would mean cracking that image, and to them, that feels like losing power. So instead of processing their mistakes, they redirect the weight of those mistakes onto someone else. This is where projection becomes their primary strategy. Projection is not random, it is calculated, even if unconsciously. Whatever they are guilty of, whatever they fear being exposed for, whatever truth threatens their identity, they assign it to another person. If they are dishonest, they accuse you of lying. If they are manipulative, they claim you are controlling. If they are the source of conflict, they paint you as the problem. This is not confusion, it is deflection. You must understand the psychological mechanics behind this. A narcissist is not just avoiding blame, they are protecting a fragile internal structure. Their sense of self is not built on truth, it is built on perception. That means they depend heavily on how others see them. Accountability threatens that perception. So instead of adjusting their behavior, they attempt to adjust the narrative. And this is why you may feel disoriented when dealing with them. You know what happened? You remember the sequence of events, yet somehow the story is twisted in a way that places you at fault. Over time, if you are not grounded, you may begin to question your own reality. This is the danger of prolonged exposure to projection. It creates confusion, self-doubt, and emotional exhaustion. But here's the truth you must anchor yourself in. Blame is not always evidence of guilt. Sometimes it is evidence of avoidance. When someone consistently shifts responsibility away from themselves and onto others, it reveals not strength, but immaturity. It shows a refusal to grow. Growth is impossible without accountability. You cannot correct what you refuse to acknowledge. And because a narcissist avoids this process, they remain stuck in cycles. The same patterns repeat: broken relationships, recurring conflicts, unstable environments. And each time the explanation is the same: someone else is at fault. You must resist the urge to accept responsibility for things that are not yours. Compassion does not mean carrying someone else's consequences. Understanding does not mean agreeing with false accusations. There is a difference between being empathetic and being manipulated. One builds connection, the other destroys clarity. When you encounter projection, your response must be rooted in awareness, not emotion. Do not rush to defend yourself in every situation. A person committed to misunderstanding, you will not be convinced by explanation. Sometimes the most powerful response is consistency, continuing to act in truth regardless of the narrative being created about you. It is also important to recognize that projection often intensifies when the narcissist begins to lose control. When their influence weakens, when people start seeing through the illusion, or when consequences begin to surface, their need to assign blame increases. It becomes more aggressive, more persistent, and sometimes more public. Not because you have done something new, but because their situation has become more unstable. This is where emotional discipline becomes essential. You cannot allow someone else's inability to take responsibility to disrupt your sense of identity. You must know who you are, independent of their accusations. Clarity is your protection. And remember this: people who are committed to truth will eventually see truth. It may take time, but consistency reveals character. You do not need to force others to understand your side. Focus on living in alignment and let your actions speak over time. In the end, projection is not power. It is a sign of internal disorder. It is what happens when someone refuses to face themselves. And while they may temporarily succeed in shifting blame, they cannot escape the consequences of their own actions. Because accountability may be avoided in conversation, but it cannot be avoided in reality. Emotional manipulation may appear powerful on the surface, but it is one of the weakest forms of control because it cannot sustain itself over time. It feeds on reaction, not reality. A narcissistic individual understands how to provoke emotions, fear, guilt, confusion, even sympathy, to maintain influence over others. They study patterns, learn your sensitivities, and use your empathy as an entry point. But what they often fail to realize is that emotions, when not rooted in truth, eventually exhaust both the manipulator and the one being manipulated. Manipulation is not leadership. It is not influence built on respect or trust. It is pressure built on distortion. It relies heavily on creating an unstable emotional environment where clarity is constantly interrupted. One day you are praised, the next day you are criticized. One moment you feel valued, the next you feel diminished. This inconsistency is not accidental, it is strategic. It keeps you seeking approval, trying to stabilize something that was never meant to be stable in the first place. However, emotional control requires constant maintenance. It cannot function independently. The manipulator must continuously create scenarios, reinterpret events, and shift narratives to keep the illusion alive. And this is where the weakness lies. Anything that needs constant distortion to survive is already in decline. Truth, on the other hand, does not require reinforcement. It stands on its own. Over time, people begin to notice patterns. The confusion that once felt personal starts to reveal itself as a repeated cycle. The emotional highs and lows begin to lose their intensity because awareness starts to grow. And once awareness enters, manipulation begins to lose its grips. You can only be controlled to the degree that you remain unaware. The moment you recognize the pattern, you begin to detach from it. There is also an internal cost for the one who manipulates. Living in a state of constant control creates inner instability. They may appear confident externally, but internally there is a continuous effort to manage perceptions, to maintain the image, and to avoid exposure. This creates pressure, mental, emotional, and even physical. And eventually that pressure manifests as cracks in their system. Relationships begin to fail, trust erodes, and their credibility weakens. For you, the one on the receiving end, the breakthrough comes when you stop responding emotionally to every trigger. This does not mean you become cold or indifferent. It means you become aware and intentional. You learn to pause instead of react. You learn to question instead of assume. You begin to separate facts from feelings. And in doing so, you remove the very fuel that manipulation depends on. When you no longer react in predictable ways, the manipulator loses their script. Their strategies become ineffective because they are designed for a version of you that no longer exists. This is why growth is so threatening to a narcissistic individuals. Your clarity disrupts their control. Your calm exposes their chaos. And your independence removes their influence. It is important to understand that true power is not about controlling others. It is about mastering yourself. Emotional manipulation seeks to dominate externally, but it ignores internal development. And because of that, it has an expiration date. It may produce short-term results, but it cannot create long-term stability, meaningful relationships, or genuine respect. So when you see someone using emotional tactics to control outcomes, do not be intimidated by it. Recognize it for what it is, a temporary strategy with a guaranteed end. Your responsibility is not to fight it aggressively, but to outgrow it completely. When you operate from clarity, self-awareness, and truth, you become untouchable by systems that rely on confusion. In the end, emotional manipulation collapses under the weight of its own inconsistency. It cannot build anything lasting because it is not built on anything real. And once you understand that, you will no longer feel trapped by it. You will see it clearly, rise above it, and move forward with a strength that cannot be controlled. There is something about truth that makes it unstoppable. You can delay it, deny it, disguise it, and even bury it under layers of illusion, but you cannot destroy it. Truth has a nature that demands expression. It does not rely on human approval to exist, and it does not disappear simply because someone refuses to acknowledge it. It operates on a higher principle, revelation. When a person builds their life on manipulation, deception, and control, they are essentially constructing a reality that is out of alignment with truth. And while that false reality may appear stable for a season, it carries within it the seeds of its own exposure. Why? Because anything that contradicts truth must constantly be maintained, defended, and reinforced. It is exhausting to sustain a lie because a lie has no independent power. It must borrow energy from continuous effort. A narcissistic individual often becomes highly skilled at managing appearances. They curate perceptions, control narratives, and influence how others see them. But perception is not reality. And eventually the gap between who they pretend to be and who they truly are begins to widen. That gap becomes pressure. And pressure, when it reaches a certain point, always releases. Truth does not need urgency, it needs time. It is patient. It waits. And while it waits, it allows actions to accumulate. Patterns begin to form. Inconsistencies start to surface. People begin to notice what they once ignored. What was once hidden in isolated incidents becomes visible as a repeated behavior. And that is how truth reveals itself, not always in a single dramatic moment, but often through a gradual unveiling that becomes impossible to ignore. This is why you must not be disturbed when lies seem to win temporarily. What you are seeing is not victory, it is delay. Delay is not denial. It is simply the period between action and exposure. Many people lose their peace because they expect immediate justice. But life does not always operate on your preferred timeline. It operates on precision. For the narcissist, this process is particularly intense. Because their identity is often built on external validation, the moment truth begins to surface, their entire foundation starts to shake. The image they work so hard to protect becomes threatened. And instead of adjusting their behavior, they often double down on denial. They may become more defensive, more aggressive, and more desperate to control the narrative. But desperation is not strength. It is evidence that something is collapsing internally. At this stage, blame becomes their primary tool. If they can redirect attention away from themselves, they can buy more time. If they can convince others that you are the problem, they can preserve their illusion a little longer. But again, truth is not dependent on public opinion. Even if people believe the lie for a while, reality does not change. And eventually, reality has a way of confronting perception. You must learn to trust this process, not emotionally, but intellectually. Understand that you do not need to fight for truth to exist. Your responsibility is not to expose everything, it is to remain aligned. When you try to force revelation, you often step into unnecessary conflict. But when you remain consistent, grounded, and clear, you allow truth to speak for itself through time. There's also a deeper wisdom here. Truth does not only expose others, it refines you. It teaches you patience. It teaches you restraint. It teaches you the discipline of not reacting to every false accusation. Because reacting impulsively often pulls you into the same chaos you are trying to escape. And here is the most important part. When truth finally surfaces, it does not need explanation. It becomes self-evident. The patterns become undeniable. The contradictions become visible. And the very people who once believed the illusion begin to question it. Not because you forced them to, but because truth reached them in its own time. So do not measure reality by what is visible in the moment. Measure it by what is consistent over time. Because time is the greatest partner of truth. And no matter how long it takes, no matter how deeply something is hidden, what is real will always find its way to the surface. There comes a critical point in every person's life where they must confront a powerful truth. You are not assigned to repair people who are committed to misunderstanding themselves. Many individuals fall into the trap of believing that love means fixing, rescuing, or carrying someone else's emotional weight. But that belief, while it may feel noble, is deeply destructive. It pulls you out of alignment with your own purpose and entangles you in cycles that drain your identity, your peace, and your progress. When you encounter a narcissistic personality, this truth becomes even more important. These individuals often create environments where responsibility is distorted. They subtly and sometimes aggressively shift the burden of their behavior onto others. Over time, you may begin to feel that it is your duty to make things right, to calm their chaos, or to prove your innocence. But understand this clearly. Stepping into that role does not solve the problem, it reinforces it. You must recognize that every human being has been given the responsibility of managing their own character. No one can grow on borrowed accountability. No one can evolve if someone else is constantly absorbing the consequences of their actions. When you attempt to fix someone who refuses to take responsibility, you interrupt a process that is necessary for their development. You become a cushion that softens the impact of lessons they were meant to learn. Alignment, therefore, is not about controlling others. It is about governing yourself. It is about ensuring that your thoughts, your actions, and your decisions are consistent with truth, integrity, and purpose. When you're aligned, you do not feel compelled to chase validation or to correct every false narrative spoken about you. You understand that your life is not defined by someone else's perception, but by the consistency of your character. This is where detachment becomes a sign of strength, not weakness. Detachment does not mean you lack compassion. It means you have wisdom. It means you understand the difference between helping and enabling. Helping supports growth. Enabling sustains dysfunction. And if you're not careful, you can confuse the two, especially when emotions are involved. There is also a deeper psychological shift that must take place within you. You must release the desire to be understood by people who are committed to misunderstanding you. That desire can trap you in endless cycles of explanation, defense, and frustration. You will find yourself repeating the same truths, hoping that clarity will eventually change their perception. But clarity is only effective when the listener values truth. If someone is invested in distortion, no amount of explanation will bring resolution. Instead, you must develop the discipline to let your life speak for itself. Your peace, your growth, your consistency, these become your evidence. You do not need to argue your way into being right. You need to live in a way that reflects alignment. Over time, truth has a way of revealing itself without your intervention. It is also important to understand that choosing yourself is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of responsibility. When you prioritize your mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being, you are not abandoning others. You are preserving the very foundation that allows you to live effectively. You cannot pour from a place of depletion. You cannot lead, build, or grow if you are constantly recovering from someone else's chaos. And so you must make a decision. Will you continue to invest your energy into fixing what refuses to change? Or will you invest in becoming who you are meant to be? One path leads to exhaustion and confusion. The other leads to clarity and growth. When you choose alignment, you step into a different level of awareness. You begin to see situations for what they truly are, not for what you hope they would be. You stop personalizing behavior that was never about you. And most importantly, you reclaim your power, the power to direct your life, your energy, and your focus towards something that produces results, not just reactions. In the end, your role is not to carry others through their consequences. Your role is to walk in truth so that your life becomes an example of what alignment looks like. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone who refuses to grow is to step aside and allow life to teach them what you never could. Growth demands a level of separation that many people resist because it feels uncomfortable, unfamiliar, and sometimes even painful. But the truth is, you cannot evolve while remaining emotionally entangled in environments that continuously drain, confuse, or diminish you. Every toxic cycle survives on participation. It needs your reactions, your explanations, your emotional investment. The moment you begin to withdraw from that cycle, not with anger, but with clarity, you disrupt the very system that once held you captive. Detachment is often misunderstood. It is not bitterness. It is not coldness. It is not the absence of care. It is the presence of wisdom. It is the ability to recognize what is no longer aligned with your growth and choosing with intention not to engage in it. You are not disconnecting because you hate someone. You are disconnecting because you understand yourself. And understanding yourself is one of the highest forms of power a person can attain. When you are connected to a narcissistic pattern, you are often conditioned to feel responsible for things that were never yours to carry. You are made to believe that if you just explain better, love harder, or sacrifice more, things will change. But growth begins when you realize that no amount of effort can transform someone who is committed to avoiding accountability. At that point, your responsibility shifts, not toward fixing them, but toward freeing yourself. This is where many people struggle Because detachment requires discipline. It requires you to sit in silence when you are used to defending yourself. It requires you to walk away when every instinct tells you to stay and prove your worth. It requires you to release the need for validation from someone who is incapable of giving it in a healthy way. And that process can feel like loss, even when it is actually liberation. You must understand that every time you re-engage in a toxic cycle, you reinforce it. You teach the other person that access to you is still available, that your boundaries are flexible, that your peace is negotiable. But when you begin to detach consistently, something powerful happens. You reclaim your energy, your mind becomes clearer, your emotions become more stable, and you begin to see situations not through the lens of confusion, but through the lens of truth. There is also a deeper transformation that occurs within you. Detachment creates space, and in that space, you begin to rediscover who you are without the constant interference of manipulation. You reconnect with your values, your priorities, your sense of direction. You begin to grow, not in reaction to someone else's behavior, but in alignment with your own purpose. And let's be clear, growth is not always comfortable. It will challenge your habits, your beliefs, and sometimes even your identity. But discomfort is often the indicator that change is taking place. The question is not whether it feels easy, the question is whether it is necessary. And separating from toxic cycles is always necessary if you intend to live a life of clarity, stability, and self-respect. You are not meant to stay in environments that require you to shrink in order to survive. You are not designed to continuously pour into situations that never replenish you. Your life has value, and that value must be protected. Not by controlling others, but by controlling your level of access to what harms you. At some point, you must make a decision. Will you remain in a cycle that keeps you stagnant, or will you step into a process that allows you to grow? Because you cannot do both. Evolution requires movement, and movement often begins with letting go. So when you choose to detach, understand what you are really choosing. You are choosing peace over chaos. You are choosing clarity over confusion. You are choosing self-respect over emotional dependency. And most importantly, you are choosing a future that is not defined by someone else's dysfunction, but by your own development. That is not weakness. That is strength in its most refined form.